going to take you through a different aspect of data stewardship, I guess, to what has been covered in the first and second days. And that's for me to introduce you to this idea of the RDM service model and functions. And I'm just showing this diagram again that I think we saw earlier this week. And really, just to illustrate that out of all this, we're now going to try and concentrate on this, the infrastructure. So just to recap what the different roles of the data steward might be, that unlike most other roles, data stewards traverse this researcher and service provider barrier. And you really need to know, have knowledge from both these perspectives. So yes, there are these three key areas, policy, research, and infrastructure. And as I say, we're going to be concentrating more on this. And of course, the FAIR principles are at the heart of it. So hopefully, you did have a look at this document, which I think has been linked to in the chat, and you will have seen this diagram. And it's just an illustration of how we're going to go about things today. Just to break it down a bit, what we're seeing here in this circle in the center is essentially that curation life cycle that maybe you're all familiar with. Curation life cycle where from the point of creation of a data object through to its eventual preservation and publication. Roughly speaking, this isn't a one-to-one mapping, but it's roughly speaking on a par with that. But outside of that circle, you've got these four other things: advisory services, training, RDM policy and strategy, and business plans and sustainability. So together, there are 10 headings that this RDM services covers. And for each of these, you'll find that there are actually subheadings as well. So you've got these 10 main headings, but there are actually subheadings that you can see as well. And you should have seen that in that document that was linked to. Today, we're actually not going to go through every one of these in the exercise we're about to do. We're actually only going to concentrate on 3 of them, namely the training, the data management planning, and the advisory services, but more on that later. So for each of those different headings, as I said, there's 10 main headings, but then many of those actually have subheadings as well. But for every one of those, what we're going to do, this RISE framework allows you to give them a rating, basically. And the rating is either level 1, 2, or 3, meaning level 1 is compliance with funder expectations. That's basically like a baseline, just getting things over the line, minimal effort. Level 2 is locally tailored services. So a bit of extra effort has been put into the services so that it's more bespoke, let's say. And then level 3, we have sector leading. And so a lot of effort and finances have been thrown into these services. Indeed, you can have certification as well. For example, some repositories have trustworthiness certifications. And basically, that means they meet a lot of standards that have been established, and so they're really pushing boundaries to make sure that they're sustainable and trustworthy. Indeed, some repositories can also get ISO certifications as well, which is really the gold standard. You'll also notice here that there is a level 0, and that essentially means non-existent. So there is that as well, but really, we're looking at 1, 2, and 3. But if you think that a service doesn't actually exist, then you can choose to say level 0. So yes, using the RISE framework, which I think I've actually forgotten to tell you what that stands for, but hopefully you know already. So RISE stands for Research Infrastructure Self-Evaluation. So yes, using this to take stock and plan. It sets the scope and identifies the context. It classifies current provision for relevant capabilities and identifies any feasible changes to aim for. By so doing, you might have heard of gap analyses, and that's essentially what we're doing here, a gap analysis. So please note that there is no right level, sorry, the right level is what makes sense in your institutional context, and that higher is not necessarily better. So what we're trying to say here is, depending on the institution that you might work at, for example, some institutions are very research heavy as opposed to teaching. And so the infrastructure should reflect that. If you're producing a lot of data through research, then you should perhaps think about having the appropriate services to actually be able to manage all that data. However, if you're more focused on teaching, then maybe you don't need such services. And of course, there's a financial consideration here. And indeed, for example, the University of Edinburgh, where I'm based, they've spent a lot of money on building bespoke services for their researchers and students. But that's based on a business plan that they undertook because it is a research intensive university. And so they wanted to take ownership of their data. And so to do that, they built a lot of services. For example, an institutional repository. There's also a service which is basically their own Dropbox. But because it's their own version of Dropbox, the data doesn't go externally. It stays within their servers, and that means anything that goes wrong, then they still have ownership of that data. So that's just a link to how to use RISE, but I think you have already seen that. Indeed, that's probably the link that is in the chat. So just to give a bit more detail before we actually go into the exercise, I told you this already, but just to put it into a slide context here. So level one, I said to you, it's basically the baseline level of providing a service. So the service provides, so for example, in this heading for security management, so one of those 10 headings, these are the three choices that you might encounter. So for level one, the service provides authenticated access to storage that is protected from unauthorized data access, and researchers are made aware of procedures for data protection and de-identification. So I hope you can see here that, yeah, it seems like there's a minimum amount of effort that was put into actually meeting these requirements. Whereas at level two, it could be that the service provides tools and environments that enable researchers to de-identify, encrypt, or control access to data as required. So it's one level up. It provides a slightly more tailored approach to what the users might need. Whereas at level three, the service provides researchers from across the institution with access to ISO, blah, 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 or equivalently accredited facilities for analysis of shared sensitive data. And, as I mentioned earlier, for example, ISO standards, they're like the gold standard for certifying the services that might be put into place. To do so might cost a lot of money to get ISO certification. And again, it's that balance that only you'll be able to determine, is it really necessary in your local institution to do that? Because, yeah, Are you producing enough data, for example?